Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Riverside Church's Remember and Repair Series Class 3. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you're doing well on this snowy day as we join together from all over. Wanted to give a brief recap of where we are. This is our third session, and we're so looking forward and honored to have several seminary executives join us today. Dr. Pam Davis will introduce them shortly. But first, at our first session, we were honored to hear Riverside's interim senior minister, Reverend Michael Livingston, kick off our series by asking, what must we remember in order to successfully repair? His lecture is available now to watch on our YouTube page. And then last week, Dr. Gary Dorian from Union Theological Seminary brought us a powerful lecture on Riverside's founding pastor, Reverend Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick. And his lecture will also be available on YouTube. Today, we are honored to welcome seminary executives to lead us in a panel discussion today. We are also welcoming today in the Zoom room several of Riverside's clergy, our interim senior pastor, Reverend Livingston, and we extend a warm welcome to our church council chairs, Phil Salmon, Reverend Geraldine Howard, and other members of the church council. Welcome. Riverside's new members class is also joining us today, and we also welcome guests from Union Theological Seminary, Jewish Theological Seminary, New York Theological Seminary, and Auburn Seminary and Episcopal Divinity School that are joining us today. A very, very warm welcome to everyone that is joining us. We're so glad you are with us. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Reverend Bruce Lamb, Riverside's Minister of Faith Formation. I'm a proud 2016 Union Theological Seminary alum and also have a connection to Auburn Seminary. When I graduated from Union, I was honored to receive an award from Auburn, the Maxwell Fellowship Grant for Excellence in Parish Ministry. It's an honor to see how all of our seminary, we can learn so much and stay connected together. Such a powerful thing our seminaries do for our students. So I'm so grateful to have our seminary executives with us today. I also was invited to tell you briefly a little bit about Riverside's Faith Formation Ministry. Thank you to Remember and Repair Series chairs, Martha Wiggins and Farrell Folk-Mafoyo for this invitation. The mission statement of the Riverside Faith Formation Ministry exists to nourish and grow the faith of everyone who comes to us seeking to know God. The programs of our Faith Formation Ministry will help you explore, challenge, ask questions about life, and grow closer to God and one another. So with this mission statement in mind as our guide, we have come together to deepen our faith and work of justice, and we have created a series of programs that have looked to bring us closer together to God and also to live out our call as justice seekers. So I'd like to highlight briefly 3 programs that have helped us pave this way to lead us today to our Remember and Repair series. In 2020, we launched a program called Wrestling with God, an all-church Bible study series that looked at readings each week with our goal centered to specific issues that Riverside was facing. And together we worked to facilitate church unity, enhance faith formation and justice work, and raise the consciousness of God's will as Riverside faces its future. Next, in the spring and summer of 2020, we offered a series called Race to Action. This class considered what it means for our congregation and each of us to be an anti-racist in this watershed moment for our church and society. Our primary references were the books How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi and White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And our goal with this series was not just knowledge, but also transformation and action. And finally, our Belonging Again series was a class that was offered in the fall that looked at how biblical stories are often uncritically taught, preached, and composed to music as if they are inclusive of a people's history and culture, when according to systematic theologian Willie James Jennings, there are actually fragments of them. So this powerful series concluded with ways in which the Riverside Church community and beyond can become a profound pathway to authentic community, hope, and healing. So now that brings us to our program that we're in now, this Remember and Repair series, and to our work today. We invite you to join our faith formation ministry at Riverside, and you are all welcome to join. All of our classes year-round are free and open to all by going to trcnyc.org/small groups. Over the last 2 years of the pandemic, we have had over 1,000 people join us online for these classes, and we are so glad you are with us today. Now I'd like to alert you toward the end of today's session, you will be asked to share 1 to 2 takeaways from today's presentations and discussion. Please be thinking about, as we listen, what you would like to share as your takeaways, especially about what is ours to remember and what is ours to repair. You will be invited to share your takeaways in the chat, or you can also email the takeaways to us at education@trcnyc.org. Thank you so much. We are so glad you are all with us today. A big warm welcome on behalf of the Riverside Faith Formation Ministry, the Education Commission, the Mission and Social Justice Commission, Anti-Racism Task Force, and the Riverside's Archives. Many sponsors have worked together to put this program on today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Pam Davis, co-convener of the Riverside Church Anti-Racism Task Force, to introduce our speakers. Good afternoon, Dr. Davis. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Reverend Lamb. And thank you, everybody. My mission here is to introduce the speakers, but I invite you to also take a look at their full biographies, which are on the website at the Remember Repair tab. I'll start right away because we have a lot to get to. First, I'll introduce President Serene Jones. She's the 16th president of the Union Theological Seminary and the first woman to lead that institution in their 182 years. She occupies the Johnston Family Chair for Religion and Democracy, and she's a past president of the American Academy of Religion. Before Union, she was a Titus Street professor of theology at Yale University Divinity School and chair of the university's program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She's the author of several books, including Trauma and Grace, and most recently her memoir, Call It Grace, Finding Meaning in a Fractured World. Welcome, President Jones. Next, I'll introduce you to President Emma Jordan-Simpson of the Auburn Theological Seminary. Dr. Jordan-Simpson became president of the Auburn Seminary very recently, actually, in October 2021. She's a Fisk University first-generation college student and graduated after serving as one of the Fisk Jubilee singers and chaplain to the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Alpha Betas chapter, as well as student chaplain to the Fisk Memorial Chapel. She has her Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary and a certificate from Columbia Business School Institute for Not-for-Profit Management, as well as a Doctor of Ministry degree with distinction from Drew Theological School. She is married to Reverend Dr. Gary Simpson and delights in their 3 adult children. So welcome, Reverend Dr. Jordan-Simpson. Next, I'll move on to Chancellor Shuly Reuben Schwartz of Jewish Theological Seminary, Irving Lehman Research Professor of American Jewish History, and the 8th Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary and the first woman to ever assume this role. She was the Dean of the Albert A. List College of Jewish Studies That's the undergraduate program that works with Columbia University, Barnard College, and JTS. She was formerly the Dean of Gershon Kext Graduate School, and she assumed the provostship while continuing to be the dean there. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Rabbi's Wife, and that looks at the role of rabbis' wives in the development of American Jewish life. So welcome, Dr. Schwartz. Our next distinguished guest is President LaKeesha Walrond of New York Theological Seminary. She's the first woman and the first African-American to serve as president for the New York Theological Seminary in New York City. She's a dynamic speaker, and she's been honored to share her words with several institutions. Just to highlight of the range, she's spoken with the New York Liberty, WNBA team, as well as had the LaKeesha Walrond Day in New York City and in October 26th of 2019. She's a native Texan, and she earned her bachelor's degree from Spelman. She has a master's and PhD from the University of North Carolina and a master's of divinity from Union Theological Seminary. Dr. Walrond is married to Reverend Walrond, and they are blessed and proud parents of Michael III and Jasmine Dominique. Welcome, Dr. Walrond. And finally, our moderator is the Very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. She's Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary. She's the Bill and Judith Moyer's Chair of Theology there and Canon Theologian at the Washington National Cathedral. She's also a theologian in residence at Trinity Church in Wall Street. Dean Douglas's academic work focuses on womanist theory, sexuality and the Black church, and racial and social justice. Some highlights are that she was a professor of religion at Goucher College, where she held the Susan D. Morgan Professorship of Religion and is now Professor Emeritus. She was associate professor of theology at Howard University School of Divinity and assistant professor of religion at Edward Waters College. She preaches in pulpits across the nation, speaks at universities around the globe, and you can follow her in print, broadcast, and digital media when she speaks on social justice and racial justice. She's the author of several articles, op-eds, books, including her most recent book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter, and also the groundbreaking book, Sexuality and the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective, which was the first to address the issue of homophobia within the Black church community. She's ordained as an Episcopal priest and holds a master's degree in theology and a PhD in systemic theology from Union Theological Seminary. Like I said, you can definitely read more on our website. And if you're like me, you're going to follow up by looking into their vast works, because there's a lot to know about these honorable panelists. Thank you.
So Pamela, I guess that means you're turning this over to me at this time.
I am, yes. I'm trying to put in the chat. I don't want anybody to miss all the stuff that I know that I had to make brief. So I'm sorry. Now you can take it away.
Well, thank you so much for having us all here, and thank you for the honor and privilege of moderating this conversation with this wonderful group of wisdom leaders, my colleagues and friends. And so I want to jump right in so that we can have a dynamic conversation this afternoon. And Serene, I'll begin with you, but would like, and if I may call you all, and I say Serene, and so no disrespect to any of you, because we are colleagues and friends. And so, but I will begin with you, and like each of you, to address just the theme of this conversation, this theme of remembering and repair in the context of racial justice. What does, and in this context in which, and perhaps we should say, I always say racial justice is aspirational, in this context of continual racial injustice on our way toward, we hope, becoming a more racially just society and a more just world. So what Serene, does these notions of remembering and repair say or mean to you?
Thank you, Kelly. And I would begin with my answer to that question to say, everyone listening to this should go online and order Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter, because it is an entire book actually devoted to that question, and goes through an extensive history of Christianity and its roots and the historic and systemic racism that has long run through it, and then brings us up to the present and gives us theological groundings for thinking about this question. And in that book, Kelly represents what is a very strong tradition at Union. Kelly herself was a student of James Cone, who was the founding voice of Black theology, and also a member of Riverside Church, which is important for people to know. I remember many times coming to Riverside and seeing Dr. Cone in the back right corner, sitting on a pew, slipping in just in time for the sermon and slipping out quietly right after the sermon was finished. So he was loved Riverside and loved his time there. But I think there's lots to say about memory and care. Union, in an ongoing way, is doing the work. Instead of calling it diversity, equity, inclusion, we're calling it justice, equity, and inclusion, and going through a process of looking at our own history and our own present and having deep and sustained conversations about what it means as an individual institution to look at memory and repair. But the tension is that every time you're looking at it as an individual institution, you're immediately aware that you're part of a bigger systemic and cultural context in which there are multiple levels of memory and endless avenues of repair, and that all the students at Union are actually going to be going into other particular communities where this question of memory and repair is going to be inevitably at the forefront of the work that they do. And I am teaching a course this semester on trauma, and all of the material on trauma, and specifically trauma, begins by talking about what a complicated thing memory is. That the hardest, the most violent things, the things that cause the most damage to the human spirit, are the things that get shut down and turned off when it comes to how we tell the story of our individual lives, of our collective lives, and our historical lives. And so part of the very hard work to even begin the conversation about repair is to do the work of revelation, of revealing, of peeling back the layers and hearing the voices and the stories that carry so much violence and repression in them, that it's not as if they're like sitting there waiting to burst forth. The way violence works in history is that it actually has the capacity to destroy memory and destroy voice. And so that's the really hard work of pulling together memory told from multiple contexts, that is told in such a way as our leadership around our justice, equity, and inclusion work says, you cannot heal what you don't reveal, which I think is just a very pithy way to talk about the work ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Serena. And I promise you all, I did not pay her to talk about resurrection hope. But thank you. And you cannot heal what you don't reveal, and this notion of trauma. And we want to get back to that, but I want to give everyone a chance to speak to this topic of memory and repair. And so Dr. Emma Jordan, Emma, we turn to you, Emma Jordan-Simpson.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be here and looking forward to all of this conversation. And thanks to Riverside and all for gathering us. I want to speak a little bit more personally about memory and repair, remembering and repair. And I hope that you will hear me leaning forward a bit. I have been at Auburn Seminary 4 months tomorrow. And so I hope that we will talk a little bit about where Auburn has been, but I hope that you will hear me leaning forward a bit. One of the grounding songs that I carry with me is a song called Run, Mary, Run. It is one of the spirituals of my people. And the words are, run, Mary, run. I know the other world does not like this. And the verses are, sing, Mary, sing, teach, Mary, teach, love, Mary, love, work, Mary, work, rest, Mary, rest. I know the other world is not like this. And the world in Mary's view is not a world limited to another realm. It's a world of truth and justice and healing and repair and flourishing life that begins now in the hearts of people who love one another. And so because of faith, I associate remembering with love, with yearning to be connected and to yearning to be in community. And in the very narrow and specific example of my own faith tradition, I think about the call to the Lord's Supper, which is this ritualized remembrance of the table where Jesus shared so intimately with his disciples. And it was a place where even among the beloved, even with the bread, the wine, the covenant, the community, the grace of the fellowship, even among all of that, there was brokenness. And so when I sing the songs of my people, I'm also remembering. And when I tell our stories and preach, I'm rehearsing with my community an experience that is all at once memory, it's embodied in the now, it's pointing us toward the future, but we are also acknowledging brokenness. You know, the blue notes, the ring shouts, the morning songs, the coded spirituals, we are acknowledging brokenness. The question that I've been asking myself, in meditating on this topic today is I'm thinking, what does remember mean in the American context when, despite what has been proclaimed, we don't really share a story. We don't share a narrative that we can all rehearse together in love and with joy. We have stories that are imposed on us, but we're not a story that we all share. And one can grow up in this country, you can attend the best schools and never have to encounter the underside of American history. You never have to learn how to interpret complicity in brokenness. Never have to learn about the beauty and the joy and the contributions of Black people, of the indigenous peoples. Our founding stories are of manifest destiny and victories over, the so-called heathens. It's a narrative of innocence and exceptionalism. And so to issue this call for Americans to remember in a way that shapes the road toward repair is really an invitation that requires radically accessible theological education for clergy and laity, radically accessible ongoing education, intentional soul care that is about teaching people to hear and to hold truths It's about credible facilitators of learning and the kind of commitment to healing that inspires leaders, I think, to create the circumstances and the opportunities for their communities to tell, to hear, to hold the truths that lead to healing. I think that we're seeing book banning and this fear of critical race theory, the big boogeyman critical race theory, in part because people are going to have to confront the depths of falsehoods that we all have been sold by the institutions that we hold as sacred and just. And we'll have to deal with the impact of the centuries of denial, and we'll have to deal with moral injury. And none of that will be easy. None of that is easy. And liberation and healing, it's not linear, you know, and we all live in a world that slavery made, that racism and white supremacy is not the shark, it's the water we swim in. And there are implications for swimming in that water for all of us. And I'll just, you know, end by saying that when I read the sermons of the Christian slave apologists and advocates, the pastors and the bishops and the laymen who spoke on the matter of US slavery in the mid-1800s, I'm reminded that arguments for dehumanizing and othering people really don't change. They don't change. And I read these sermons and I try to hold on to what I am feeling when I read those sermons, when I encounter those messages, and try to name what I'm feeling and stay in my body, not as an academic exercise, but as a neighbor. I don't ever want to forget what it feels like to read the conclusions of these Christian leaders that were couched in scripture, conclusions that defined me as a Black person as biblically vile and abominable. And I don't want to forget that, because the thing about this world that's shaped by slavery, it's shaped to eventually make us all complicit in our own oppression, complicit in systemic oppression. And so as I'm remembering history as a Black woman, my healing, my repair depends on my remembering not to use the master's tools for rationalizations and not to accept this very small story, this very small narrative that we have been given, and to keep pushing for that bigger story that includes us all, includes the hope of us all, and holds for the flourishing of us all.
Thank you again so much, Emma. So much for further discussion, and this notion of not only trauma, but moral injury and accessibility that you have mentioned. And I want us to think about those issues some more in this discussion. But now I'm going to turn to Shuly. Can you please respond?
Thank you. And my opportunity to thank Riverside Church, all of you for bringing us together. Thank you for those moving words, Emma, and for your important words, Serene. And I'll just try to pick up and move along on these issues, on these questions of what it means to remember and the necessity of remembering. You know, the word remember, the Hebrew word zachor, it appears over 200 times in the Hebrew Bible. Today, sadly, it's usually remembered with respect to Jews, reminding us to remember all of the horrible things that happened to the Jews from the biblical Amalekites to the Holocaust. We just had Holocaust Remembrance Day just a few days ago, to the hostage situation in a synagogue in Cooleyville, Texas, just 2 weeks ago. But it does the concept of remembering a disservice for it to only be associated with trauma. In our tradition, if you look at all of the times that the term is mentioned, remembering has much more to do with focusing our attention on a revelation that is eternally there and eternally true. This is true of remember, Zachor, remembering the Sabbath, not only keeping the Sabbath, but remembering it. Remembering when we stood at Sinai to receive the Torah. Remembering the Exodus from Egypt. That remembering is an active remembering. We say every year at the Seder, when we reenact the Exodus from Egypt, that we must remember the Exodus from Egypt as if we were there. Every one of us must try to get under that skin of what it felt like to be slaves, what it felt like to be liberated from slavery. In the Bible, God is described as remembering far more often than humans. So when we humans remember, we are imitating God. Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of our illustrious faculty members from the last century, put it, as he said, recollection is a holy act. We sanctify the present by remembering the past. So far from being a remembering of days of yore, of either triumph or all too often of tragedy, in the Jewish tradition, we must remember in order to regain sight of our eternally intended mission on this earth. And just to close, and you've, of course, both of you have said this, Serene and Emma, we must be honest with ourselves. We must acknowledge historical memory of prior suffering, knowing that it is insufficient to motivate us to act on behalf of the oppressed. As the Bible scholar Nechama Leibovitz notes, the memory of your own humiliation is by itself no guarantee that you will not oppress the stranger in your own country once you have gained independence and left it all behind you. On the contrary, how often do we find that the slave of exile who gains power and freedom, or anyone who harbors the memory of suffering to himself or to his forebears, finds compensation for his sufferings by giving free rein to his tyrannical instincts when he has the opportunity to do so. So the Torah goes out of its way to train us in historical empathy over and over again. And I think I'll stop, and I know we'll pick this up in conversation.
Thank you, Shuly, and we certainly will pick this up in conversation. And I want to highlight this, that you said, memory is a holy act. We imitate God. Dr. LaKeesha, remembering and repair.
Yes, and good afternoon to everyone. What a blessing it is for us to be gathered today, and certainly to be gathered in this space of my sister presidents and leaders. Thank you so much to the Riverside Church for making this possible for us. So when I initially thought about this notion of remembering and repairing, the first image that came to my mind was of my grandmother, who was a God-fearing, very faithful mother of the church, And I thought about how she taught me to pray, and she taught me how to be in relationship with God. But often when I would ask her about things from her childhood, she wouldn't talk about those things. She didn't talk about those things. And she would say to me, you know, don't ask me about that. We're not going to talk about that. Some of the childhood memories around segregation, around Jim Crow, the way she grew up in small town Texas. I remember distinctly the first election of Barack Obama, and being in conversation with my grandmother about this election, and how she'd said to me, oh, it's never going to happen. This country will never elect a Black man as president. And certainly she was speaking from her experience in small town Texas. And so that night when he won, and we were at church having a watch party, she was the first person I called. And she was just crying on the phone. She could not believe that this had happened, and certainly could not believe that it had happened in her lifetime. And so we talked, we laughed, we cried together. But the next time I visited her, I began asking her some of those same questions that I asked as a child about how it was growing up, how it was not being able to drink from the fountain, how it was not being able to go to school every day, some of those tough questions. And she began to share answers, things that I had never heard my entire life. My childhood, I was wrestling, trying to get those answers from her. But it was something about the election of this Black man that felt like a part of her own repair, that I think gave her the permission to talk and to share some of these very difficult and some horrible stories that she experienced in her childhood. But something about that election opened her up and gave her permission to now start sharing, because for her, that experience gave her hope. And it gave her hope not only for herself, but for me as her grandchild, and certainly for generations to come. And so when I think about this notion of remembering and repair, really 4 images come up for me. And that's honesty, visibility, accountability, and responsibility. Going back to what some of my sister leaders have said, this notion of honesty, whether we're thinking about critical race theory, whether we consider that there are 2 sides to every story, whether we consider, you know, my story is that struggle of coming out of Egypt, that struggle of coming out of slavery, my ancestors who fought and bled and died to do that. But there's also another story, a story of those who lost their property, a story of those who had to work and lost their homes because of the freedom of slavery. And so being honest about that history, no matter how difficult it is, recognizing that repair is always possible. I think about visibility, being able to see people that we haven't seen before in a way that we haven't seen them before, recognizing the humanity of everyone. I listened to Sadhguru, who said one time, when the whole is divided, the parts must be named. And right now we have too many names. And so getting back to this notion of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be whole? And that is so much bigger than what you can see in terms of my skin color, of what you can observe in terms of my faith and the way that I worship. But I'm so much bigger. Therefore, because I'm bigger, recognizing the bigness of those who are around me. So being able to see people in a way that you haven't seen them before is a part of that repair. Also accountability, being responsible for the things that we say and we do. Sometimes we make things like racism, like sexism, homophobia, we make them so much bigger, and we make them issues that are so far removed from us. But the reality is, if we're laughing at the jokes, if we're making fun, if we're being complicit when we hear the N-word used, then it's not so far removed from us. It really is right where we are. And taking accountability for even those kinds of things can lead to repair. And then certainly responsibility, being responsible for our own actions. There are so many things that are beyond our control, but being able to do what we can do to lead our country, our nation, our churches, our schools forward in the notion of being responsible for how we participate in the things that we say, in the things that we ignore, in how we reference other people or other organizations, other faiths, can certainly lead us in that direction repair. I was thinking about what Dr. Shuly just said, and I remember preaching a sermon about Hannah, right? And how she prayed to God, God, remember me and do not forget me. And I was looking at that scripture saying, remember me and do not forget me. Isn't that the same thing? But when I did some further research, found that that word for remember, I believe it's sekar, but it actually means to use your power on my behalf, right? And so remembering then is not just, sitting back and thinking about something as much as it is using our power, using our influence, using everything that we have to push an agenda forward in America that recognizes the humanity of everyone. And so for me, remembering is an action word. It means praying with your feet. It means recognizing, even, as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. And so I hope that even in this conversation, as we talk about all the ways that we remember and all the possible ways of repair, that we recognize that each of us, right, has a responsibility. Each of us can be accountable. Each of us can see our brother, our sister, our friend. Each of us can be honest about our experience. And it's in those things that we can move forward, healing the breaches that we've created together.
Wow. Doctors all, so much to get into. Thank you all for that. So we're just gonna keep on moving and diving further and further in. First, this theme and Dr. Shuly and Dr. LaKeesha, that you talk about remembering rather, as an action word, whether it's from the Hebrew sakar, if I pronounce it right, or Christianity has at the center of its call to remember, do this in remembrance of me. I'm Anglican, so we talk about anamnesis, right? And that, again, is not about something that happens in the head, but it's embodying action, remembering through your body. So here's what I want to ask each of you. Each of you in some way spoke about trauma, injury, the terrible memories of history that each of you in your own stories hold in some way. So you're head of institutions, all right? And somehow we are in this in our country trying to education, re-educating and leading people to remember history in a different way. And we have this debate going on about critical race theory, et cetera. Here's the thing we know, that sometimes the remembering creates trauma. The remembering is a catalyst for moral injury. Now that's on the one hand, we hear in our institutions, students don't want to be triggered. And then we have the reality in our society where people are saying, we just have a law on the way to being passed in Florida, right? In terms of the school system, we don't want white kids to feel uncomfortable. So what do we do here? You're head of institutions, educational institutions, especially seminaries, when we have remembering at the center of our traditions. What do you do? How do you navigate that in institutions when we know that there's all of people say, oh, you're triggering me. How do you move through the responsibility to remember, to tell the stories in this way, when indeed those stories themselves, that remembering themselves, can be a catalyst, has been a catalyst for moral injury, in itself is trauma inducing. Dr. Serene, and then you all jump in as you will, but I'm going to start with you because you have done this work on trauma.
Yes, well, it's a tough question, and as each day unfolds, it's a very pertinent question and a live question. And you and I have had even extensive discussions about the whole reality of triggering and of memory and of moral injury. And yet, if you can't heal what you can't reveal, how do you occupy that space? I don't have even close to an answer to that, but I think a couple of things come to mind. First is, and Kelly, you were gesturing towards this, is that memory is not something that just exists in the books that we have written that we read, or the stories that live in our heads and our rituals. Memory also lives in our bodies, and we're not always even aware of how the way we occupy space and walk down the street and move our head and feel confident or afraid or emboldened or diminished. Those things happen in our bodies, scripted by just a long history of cultural perceptions and pressures that are put into all of us. And that's what makes the notion of triggering such a complicated one, because when I teach my course on trauma, you also you can't fully know what's going to trigger something, because people don't even know themselves that well to know what memories will bring up something that they didn't even know was living in them and creating knots in their stomach and destroying their capacity for hope or joy, for instance. The second thing about trauma and specifically the racial scripts that get pressed into our bodies. Emma said this, it's not the shark, it's the water we swim in. And so I think far too often when we're talking about the traumas of race in America and how it's been scripted, we'll say, oh, well, so Black people were scripted as Black, and Jews were scripted as Jews, and Latinx people were scripted as Latinx. But the truth of the matter is that white people were deeply scripted to be white people. And, as James Baldwin said, the Scandinavians and Norwegians didn't come to America as white people. They became white in America. And so that process also leaves deep marks. You have to create a culture in which these Norwegians and Scandinavians, to go back to Baldwin's quote, become capable of inflicting harm and enormous cruelty. So that's the other side, and of what it means to remember, is how do we remember that scripting and the inevitable pain when we're remembering of dismantling that space that lives in the white body and lives in the collective body of white supremacy. So I go back and forth on this question of not wanting by any means to speak in ways that are going to shut people down rather than open them up. That's always, that's never a good thing if it's going to shut people down and not open them up. On the other hand, I realize that if you're so cautious in stepping into the turbulent waters of the history of racial construction of reality in the United States, then you're never going to go anywhere. So you just kind of have to balance those two all the time.
So yeah, you talk of sort of the price of the ticket, right? That, as Baldwin says, it's not simply the price of the ticket for being Black in America, but really white people have to ask, what is the price of the ticket for being white in America? For being white, what's the price of the ticket for being an American, being in empire? What's the price of the ticket for being Christian in a Christian nationalist culture? And so you're right. So here's my question, and playing off this to all of you, just playing, whoever wants to jump in and listening to what Dr. Serene just said. What is, we're talking theological institutions, and so is there this particular theological mandate to not only simply remember, but to get out of the pain. How do we move out of the pain of memory? How do we do that? Because we can get stuck right in it, and if you move too quickly, you aren't being fair to the story, right? And so, yeah, what do we do here? And what do we do? And I'm struck, LaKeesha, even as you spoke to the fact that there are two sides, at least two sides, or many sides to a story, and so that you know, we know that the stories and even we share the story of the Exodus tradition, and yet you can speak that story to First Nations persons, speak that story to Africans, and they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. We aren't the ones that were freed. We're the ones whose land was taken. And so that it's also a story of liberation and manifest destiny. What do we do with these conflicting memories? What do we do with the memories that keep us in the pain, but yet we have to appreciate the pain? What, you're religious leaders, what do we do? Shuly, you're shaking your head. So what is that?
I mean, look, the way I see it, I'm the head of an educational institution, first and foremost. We are training future generations of leaders. We must confront our past, warts and all. We cannot move forward without doing that. There is not a question in my mind. Yes, do we do it with sensitivity? Of course. Do we have resources for students who need that when they are reading texts that are painful, that can be traumatizing, that can raise, as Serene said, trauma we didn't even know is embodied within us? Of course, but we do not shy away from looking at the pain in our past. And I think what saves us from getting mired in the trauma, from being traumatized in a paralyzing way, is what we talked about before, what LaKeesha, you beautifully articulated, as a follow-up, to my one sentence of like, remembering is an active verb. It is not something that you sit in the past with. It is a catalyst for the way we move forward. In our High Holiday liturgy, one of the principal sections of the High Holiday liturgy is called Zichronot, is called remembrances. And we are asking God to remember what God loves. And we hope that if God it starts off, the story we all know, did you not lovingly remember Noah, right? Okay, it's not remembering the flood, it's remembering that God, reminding God, no, remember Noah, because when you remembered Noah, you ended the flood and you saved humanity instead of dwelling on the lawlessness that caused God's wrath, caused God to bring the flood. And when we remember, what we're saying is we want to be that way too. We want to live up to our best qualities as we're asking God to live up to God's best qualities. We know God can be a God of anger and vengeance, and we know that we have all of that in us too. So it's pushing us to our best selves.
So, Emma, what's the role? I like this, that we've got to, we have responsibility, and LaKeesha talks about responsibility. We do have responsibility to remember, even, and we have to remember the pain. We know what's going on in our society today around this whole issue of just remembering. And yes, we have this responsibility to the students who come through our doors, right? Because we are training them for some form of ministry in the world, however they define that. But what becomes the responsibility of our respective institutions in trying, I'm inspired by what each of you have said, and Dr. Shuly, by what you have just said, and the responsibility to remember. We say that to each other. We say that to our students. We teach them that, but we're in a world that this society right now that refuses to remember, and we don't seem to have the moral leadership that takes us to a different place. Do our institutions have some responsibility to do that? To take the society to a different place? Let's start with you, because I see you shaking your head all through what Dr. Shuly was saying. What's the responsibility? Any of you jump in?
First of all, I'm so glad that this is going to be recorded, because I just need to go back and sit with everything that you all have said, and just, I'm so grateful for it. And so Auburn differs from, Union and JTS and NYTS in that we're not a degree granting institution, and that the leaders who come to us are folks who are deeply engaged. The people that we're partnering with are folks who are deeply engaged in the work of justice, and they are people with multiple stories. So the multi-faith leaders, bringing so many stories and so many circumstances, of memory. And I think the most powerful thing that we can keep in front of people is what happens when leaders don't remember. Like the responsibility, or how irresponsible it is to be engaged in, or trying to be engaged in, liberative work with people on the ground, and having a half story, not knowing, not knowing the story. And I think about, what we just experienced in this pandemic, and what was revealed. And what was revealed was that our systems work exactly the way that they were created to work, that they're broken, and that there are millions of people in this country who were dependent upon those systems and who were failed, and were dependent upon policies that were racist and classist, and they failed. And to not keep our eyes on the truth, it is irresponsible. And to not try to hold the memory of truth makes us ineffective. Like, we cannot lead these people. What we will be doing is engaging in the recreation of this oppression. There is an absolutely amazing exhibition, and I hope that people will get a chance to see it. It's a traveling one. It's called Undesigned the Red Line. And it looks at housing policy in the country, and how in the development of housing policy, what we did at every point where we thought we were being progressive is we just made things that much more oppressive, and not holding on to the truth, and ended up with a system that in essence makes those who have houses in this country feel like they have houses because they deserve houses. And those who don't have houses because they don't deserve houses. And we know that's not the truth. We know that's not the truth. And there is a responsibility, if we are to lead people, to first of all also deal with our own healing. Like, if we are to be healers, then we have to attend to our own our own healing. If we're to be repairers, then we have to learn what it means to tend to our own repair, and to model that with the leaders that we're called to engage with, and to find ways to include opportunities for that, in the work that we do. I am committed to justice, but I also believe that my work is to heal from being bought and sold. And there's no way that I can do that without digging into the truths that I would much rather not have to contend with. And if I don't do that, then I'm sharing wounds into the next generation. And I think that is the consequence of our not preparing all of our students, all of our leaders, for the responsibility of holding truth.
So thank you. Let me take a little turn again from what you've said. And this is not only about memory, but remembering, because it's more than memory. Remembering, but repair. And Emma, you just mentioned that word, and it's the theme here. And responsibility, this word keeps coming up. So how repair, that takes us to reparations. And people are talking, of course, reparations is a topic not only in our society, but in institutions. As we remember, and we are called to repair, to reparations, repairing the breach, if you will, if we think of it in those terms. What are each of your institutions doing? How are you as institutions, leading institutions, what are your institutions doing to model this beyond what happens in the curriculum? To model this notion of repair, memory and repair, because that together leads us to reparations. What's been the institutional response? What's going on? How is the institution modeling and taking responsibility? LaKeesha, lead the way. Everyone can jump in.
Absolutely. And so, first I do want to, I have to say that going to Spelman College from small town Texas, I was exposed to Black history in a different way. Certainly, when I got there, I didn't know who Malcolm X was. I didn't know the depth of the Atlantic slave trade. I remember sitting in classes and crying profusely because these were things that had just been kept from me. Of course, I left Spelman and then went to UNC Chapel Hill, which is a predominantly white institution where there was no conversation about any of those, these kind of deeper concerns of Black people. And then I went to Union, where I got my MDiv and had the opportunity to study with James Cone, who was the first Black man that I saw address a predominantly white class and talk about the lynching of Black men. Every class, every class, he was gonna get that in somewhere. Some classes, he spent a lot of time talking about it. Sometimes it was a passing comment, but we heard about the lynching of Black men every class. And I remember the first time when he was teaching, I kind of scrunched because I was like, oh my gosh, what are all these white people thinking, because of the way and his unapologetic way of talking about it. And so whenever he would make these comments, the few Black people in the class would kind of look and catch eyes with each other. But we kept coming back and we kept learning more. And what I learned was that while it is difficult and even uncomfortable to have some of these challenging conversations, the more we have them, the less uncomfortable we become. And so the answer is not to stop talking about these issues of remembering and repairing, but to talk about them even more, to make them a vital part of how we are teaching, one another, certainly our children, the next generation that's coming. And certainly as leaders of seminaries, we have even a more responsibility because now we are responsible for providing theological education to those who are going to go out and be leaders. Whether they are leading from the pulpit, preaching, parish ministry, whether they are leading through their writing and their research, And so we have the responsibility of making sure that this is a topic that no seminary student should be able to pass through a seminary and not have some serious engagement around issues of race and reconciliation, of remembering, of healing, of repair. And so I certainly wanted to say that about Dr. Cohn, because he really changed my life forever. I used to look forward to going to this class and hearing this man just speak his truth. And that's such a gift when we turn the things that were meant to push us down, meant to oppress us, meant to subjugate us, and we find a way, or even God finds a way for us to use those same things as tools of healing and empowerment for others. And so I think about my own life, even as a child who was molested, and thinking, I remember hearing a preacher preach one time, all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to God's purposes. And I was like, yeah, really? Well, not this thing, not the violation of my body, not the molestation, of a 9-year-old child. And then, as I began to work with other women who had gone through sexual violence, whether as a child or as an adult, and I shared my story, I realized the healing power that comes when we share our stories. And not only did the healing come through sharing the stories, but it ultimately led to me writing a book to help parents have this conversation with their children to protect their children from those perpetrators who are looking to violate them. And so I think that the more we talk, the more we provide opportunities. At NYTS, we offer a Black Lives Matter class every year. We had offered it some years back, but now we're on a path to offering it each year, where we are intentional about having those conversations. It's co-taught by a professor, Dr. Vernon Mason, who was an activist in the civil rights movement, as well as Dr. Willie Francois, who's been activist in the Black Lives Matter movement. The two of them sharing those stories, telling those stories together have made a tremendous difference. But also, one of the reasons that I came to NYTS is because we offer a Master's of Professional Studies program at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. And we know what mass incarceration has done to the African-American community. And so the fact that we've been offering this program from Dr. Bill Weber started in 1982 through 2022, we're celebrating 40 years of that program. And we're looking to replicate that so that we can continue to really manifest the power of redemption. Right. And what it means to do something, to recognize you've done it and to turn and do something different. And so, for me, it's about the conversations, it's about the stories, but it is also about what do you do after you talk? What does it look like to engage in opportunities to transform the lives of others because and influenced by your own subjugation and oppression? So I think we've got to continue having these conversations. We've got to continue having the hard talks. Yes, it's uncomfortable, so especially the first time. But the more we talk, the more we begin to expand our understanding of ourselves and those that we encounter.
Wow. Serene, thank you. I want this recorded too. But Serene, I want you to jump in, but I want to add a little sort of notch as you jump in, a little pin. So, because I know for both of you that unions engage in this diversity and this justice work, if you will. And I'm listening to everyone speak here, and we're talking about sort of telling the story, opening up the story from vantage points that haven't previously been centered, right, in our history, and the pain that it causes both to the people who have been the recipients of racism, white supremacy, et cetera, as well as the pain that it may cause to those who have to hear their story now in a different light. So couple things here. When we center, it seems to me, the story of those who've been on the underside of injustice in this regard, that it's about more than anti-racism, because anti-racism centers the white people in this, trying to help them feel good or something. So what's the difference? And I know union is engaging in this work. What's the difference between, or is there, between anti-racist work and racial justice work, right? The difference between anti-racism, because many of us don't want to be engaged in anti-racist work, and remembering and repair. What's that difference, and how is Union seeing that difference and manifesting that difference? And I'm gonna pick on you because you're my sister. Then how do you get white people to move to where LaKeesha is talking about that? Sometimes you just got to hear the story, and if you keep hearing it, you'll get better. So I know I piled on you, but go for it.
Yeah, so much in that question, and I'll just even scratch the surface of it. But yes, you're right. Anti-racism training can so easily just become about how, white people dealing with their stuff, and then it doesn't actually amount to transformation. And I think this goes back to what was earlier in our conversation, is that memory, which we could also translate as the activity of teaching and telling stories, which is what all of our institutions do day in and day out. We're just telling stories, teaching stories. And in those stories is the memory, and the good memories, the horrible memories, the lost memories, the body memories. But the telling of it is never neutral. It always serves an end. And for me, racial justice, unlike anti-racism, the term racial justice describes the reason for telling these stories is so that we can shift the context so that remedies are found. And there is, we're working to chip away at the hard surface of racial injustice. So, it has to be in the memory driven towards a vision of justice. That has to be the politics and theology behind the purpose of telling the story, even the hard stories. That's why you're not doing it just because it's fun or because, it's just, we have to tell the truth. You're actually doing it as a seminary because you think it's crucial to a future of justice. And so that vision of the just that we seek has to always be compelling us forward. And that means talking about, Emma, housing, talking about, the huge racial bias, it's beyond racial bias in home mortgages, and why in 2008, something like 45% of Black families in this country lost their mortgages, where in the white community it was something like at 12%. I mean, that's so that those statistics need to sit there when we're telling the stories, the history, the memory, and say, okay, what does that have to do with making it so that this is not our future? That this systemic injustice in housing is no more.
There are amazing things that can happen if we tell the truth, if we sit with the truth, if we engage people in truthfulness. The amazing thing is that people begin to work together in building the world that they actually want to see. There is a project that Auburn has been engaged in now called this Cartography of Possibility. And it is so when you understand that we live in this world made by slavery, and that there's a narrative that goes along with that, and it does exactly what it's intended to do, which is to keep us holding our wounds and not moving, doing the hard work that is about moving toward healing. So we live in this world. This cartography of possibility is about mapping this world that's being born, mapping a world where people are really holding, what we call world-making imagination. It's a rebuke to the maps that we have been handed by those of us who say reparations is not possible, repair is not possible. None of this it's too hard, it's too difficult, right? And it's a world that's being midwifed, I think, into by not just by Black and white Americans, but by multi-faith, multiracial, spirit-rooted leaders and leaders of moral courage across the country. And so it'll go up on our website soon, but we actually have a map of projects that are happening across the country, where people who are helping each other to hold the truth are working together to create a world that is grounded in love and justice. And so in looking at economic justice, so for instance, they're care-rooted, care-based, programs that are happening that are like mutual aid. So like in Albuquerque, New Mexico, it's a synagogue there holding a project of mutual aid. In Boston, there's the Ujama Faith Network that is about cooperatives and doing work in common and holding these ecosystems of strategies that actually return wealth and decision-making power like back to working class, Black people, poor people, indigenous communities. I think what I'm trying to say is that as long as we are following the narrative, the story that says, don't tell the truth, hold on to your wounds, and all of this, this is the world that we get and that's it. Then this is the world that we will have and that will be it. But if we can engage with students, engage with leaders in doing that work of imagination, and if we can lift our heads across the country beyond what they're, on Fox News and, the news networks and then to see the places where people actually are creating these worlds of justice. I think that, maybe holding the truth might be a little bit more attractive. It's always going to be hard, but look what can come from holding truth.
Yeah, and we're moving, time is going quickly, and I know we want to open up to the audience in a minute. So I want to leave you all out with one question and lifting up something first that I heard Serene say, and perhaps it'll come back up again, Serene, in our further discussions with the audience, and this sort of sense of the, someone put in the chat, in game of that which we are accountable to, the reason for which we are doing the work, and reminding us that we are in, you all are each in charge of these religious institutions, and that our accountability becomes to that more just future, that more just society. And so the repair that happens, not simply sort of, what is it, vertically, I always get this mixed up, but between us, but the repair that must go on between us and the world that we know that God has called us to. I'm also struck by the fact that we all sit here from our different institutions and different traditions, interfaith and more, and ethnicities. But there is one thing that everyone on this panel definitely has in common, and that is that each of you are women in charge of these theological and religious institutions. I want to ask what difference does that make? Not simply in your leadership, but in how you have engaged and are engaging this question of racial justice. I think of the intersecting realities and the Jane Crow that Pauli Murray would talk about, the intersectionality that a Kimberly Crenshaw would talk about. It must make a difference that you are embodied women and engaging this. So I just want to hear what difference does it make in the way in which you have engaged and are engaging this question of racial justice, particularly from the perspectives as head of institutions. Dr. Shuly, let's start with you. And I want each of you to answer that, if you will.
It's a great question. I'm not sure that I have a pithy answer. I know no other way to lead other than as a woman. So I don't know. Would a man be thinking differently about this? I don't know. I hope not. You know, I think the only thing that I would say is that the storytelling, the relationship building, the need to do the work, that comes very naturally to women. That is what women have been doing for millennia. Women do the work. They're not preaching out in the world. They're not pontificating. Women start by doing the work in the smallest of settings, in their families, then in their communities. And only when we've done that work have women felt that they could even begin to do that out there in the world. And while our being here today signifies that, okay, we can do that work out there, I think it's good that we don't forget that we have to start small. And certainly, you know, when I think of JTS and the ways in which we want to be allies with other institutions in the work of racial justice, that needs to be preceded by work that we do internally. And, you know, we are an institution right now that has predominantly Jewish students. Obviously, we're training Jewish leaders. The majority of those students come from an Ashkenazi Eastern European background. There is a minority within a minority of Jews of color and indigenous peoples. And so part of it is consciously trying to diversify our own community. And the other is a different kind of intersectionality, the kinds of class and status divisions between our staff and our faculty and our students. You know, we in thinking about racial justice, we began something, you know, 2 years ago that I think finally happened in the summer, called Thinking, Talking, Doing, in which 100 people across our institution just shared stories and spoke personally around race. And relationships are formed as a result. And those things are the beginnings of things that are crucial for change to happen on a broad scale.
Thank you for that. Anyone else like to jump in? That Serene, I see you off mute, so I'm going to pick on you.
Okay, I'm on mute. I wanted to just say one thing that I think is very interesting in terms of remembering in historical context, that I don't think it's any accident, given the way history unfolds, that you know, we're seeing such a rapid decline of, quote, religious life and religious institutionality in the United States. And there isn't a seminary or institution related to historical religious communities that's not in crisis. And so what do you do when you're at an inflection point and everything either is falling apart or becoming new and fresh? Well, you've got to hand it over to the women, because so it's like all of us have, in a sense, stepped into a moment in history in which there is, you know, incredible crisis and crisis within the institutions, crisis within the culture. And I think that the capacity to not shy away from the crisis, but to do the detailed, I think of it as like the housework, the work of care, the work of tending that holds communities together and and waters. It's like garden. I'm using all these household images, but that will allow new life to come, and is allowing new life to come. And that's like historically women's work, not exclusively, but I think it's like for women, and this is of course different for feminism than it is for womanism, than it is for mujeristra, than it is for, every intersectional perspective of how one occupies that. But it is also a space where embodiment matters and is always sort of called to the fore of the discussion. It's not like everybody's not embodied, everybody is embodied, but the excruciating reality of one's embodiment is in our broader culture made from the time you're born more evident to you when you're socialized to be gendered as a female. And so I think that's a whole space that opens up in leadership to attend to the body of our institutions, but also the bodies of the people who constitute our communities and our own bodies. Emma talked about, caring for our own bodies.
Wow, I mean, yes, much there. We're over 2 minutes from where we're supposed to turn over to audience. So, but I do want to give, if LaKeesha or Emma have a quick response to that. And I'm sorry, a pithy response to that, and so that we can open it up and I turn it back over to Carol and Martha. So if you have
Yes, so I just wanted to add, certainly we would be remiss, and I appreciate you asking that question around being a woman in leadership, and I'm grateful to Serene for recognizing that generally by the time an institution calls a woman, it is in crisis. And I think we can all speak from that experience, and then certainly entering as a Black woman, and thinking about Dolores Williams' sister in the wilderness, and understanding that the manifestation of race, class, and gender are at play as I enter. Also entering, recognizing, as Maya Angelou said, I am the hope and the dream, of the slave. And so I think that there is something about a woman's perspective, viewpoint, that can make more room at the table for others, particularly when we have been around tables where we haven't been invited to sit, haven't been invited to eat, being more inclusive, ensuring more accessibility, being thoughtful about the language that we're using, are pieces that we can bring to our leadership that can expand the possibility of women even considering going to seminary. And I'm speaking from down South Texas, where folks still say that seminary is a cemetery. You go there to lose your faith, as opposed to recognizing it as a place of great exploration of faith, where you can really learn in a way that expands your own imagination, and connects us more to the imagination of God, which is a very inclusive, diverse, and varied imagination.
Thank you.
And
I
I'll
like
just say,
the image of can these dry bones live? Right?
I'll just say quickly, because I think I mentioned it, earlier, that these notions, like, they do live in my body, and I don't try to deny that as a Black woman. And so there's a radar also about messiness. I think about the founding of Auburn Seminary, and how, in our history, we talk about being, of having the earliest anti-slavery societies, right? And we talk about, Harriet Tubman coming to the Bible studies at, her family coming to the Bible studies at Auburn Seminary. But we also have to talk about, and we have to talk about the fact that we took land from indigenous peoples, and we used prison labor to build. And that is the messiness and complicit of what it means, like, to be in America. And I believe, holding on to the fullness of who I am and bringing the fullness of who I am in the room, I do have a radar for that kind of messiness. And the refusal to deny that it is the truth and that there is a once and for all answer, and that maybe that there is a lens that we need to be adopting that keeps those truths in front of us as we keep pushing toward repair and healing and repair.
Thank you all. I know there are many things that we could have continued to talk about. And so this is just the tip of the iceberg. And what a privilege to be able to moderate, if you will, this conversation between the four of you and to learn a lot. And now I turn it over to Martha and Carol.